Hello, welcome back. And fun fact, the original video file for this got corrupted, so this is a second recording of the whole thing. Anyway, number 16 says that the country's net national income is less than its gross national income. What does this mean? So right, first of all, what do these two terms mean? So what you need to know is that NNI is equal to GNI minus depreciation. And GNI is equal to GDP plus net income from abroad. I'll just write that. Essentially, the gross national income, or GNI, is basically the total income earned by a country's residents or businesses, regardless of whether it was generated from inside the country or outside the country. Hence, GDP is the output of the country, so it's the value or income generated by the country itself, and net income from abroad is incomes that comes into the country from overseas, of course. Some examples will be remittances, or if a citizen from this country goes overseas and gets a job over there and earns money, that also counts as net income from abroad. Now, what's important to note is that this is gross national income. And whenever we have gross in any terminology, it means that we calculate depreciation in it. Hence, you'll notice that NNI, or net national income, is just GNI, but without the depreciation. Because in NNI, there is, of course, in the terminology itself, there is no gross or G, meaning we do not calculate depreciation. However, if there was a gross or G in it, then we do calculate depreciation. But what is depreciation anyway? So, for example, let's say you bought a really cool motorbike, right? However, the motorbike depreciates every year, and what that means is that because you're using this motorbike, of course it won't be new anymore, and it might get some paint scarred off, or it might need some repairs, or some parts of it may become worn out. So essentially that means that it's been used. It doesn't have the same value as it did when you first bought it because it's not new and all of the parts are not new or working. It doesn't work as well as it used to. So depreciation, you can also see it as the value that it has lost or the value that you have used up or consumed. And key word, if you have gross in the term, then you calculate depreciation. The depreciation, the value of it is included in its total. However, in any terminology or net national income, it doesn't have gross, meaning we do not calculate depreciation. Both of them are the total income from the country that the country receives, whether the income is coming from its own country or outside of it. However, the only main difference is that in net national income, depreciation is deducted because we don't count that because there's no gross in it. So I've been going in circles around that. But yes, just to stress that this is the difference between these two terms, and let's just look at our options now and see which one's correct. So the first one says, incomes earned overseas were less than incomes sent overseas. What this means is that if we have this little circle that is our country, that means that incomes earned overseas, incomes that we get from overseas that are coming into the country is less. So this means less. Then the incomes being sent overseas, then the incomes leaving the country and being sent out of the country. So this is more. So the net income abroad, or the net income that's coming into the country, would obviously be less because more is leaving, right? So in that case, the value of the net income from abroad will fall, meaning GNI will fall. So if GNI falls, then it falls here too, and NNI will fall here too. But does that explain why a country's net national income is less than its gross national income? No, because this doesn't explicitly explain that, because the reasoning behind why net national income is less than gross national income is because we have deducted depreciation, whereas in GNI, depreciation is included. That's the main reason. So let's check the next option and see what it says. Next one says that inflation has been accounted for in NNI but not in GNI. Well, inflation doesn't directly relate to NNI or GNI. However, inflation is related to GDP instead. Well, GDP itself doesn't have inflation accounted for it, but real GDP does. However, so this doesn't directly link to net national income or GNI, so it's unrelated, so we're also going to cross that off forgot to cross the first one off too, but let's check the next option. The next one says that the country's exports have decreased. So how does that relate? Well, we know that the value of GDP is equal to the value of aggregate demand, because aggregate demand is the total demand in the country, and what you demand is what you produce, and GDP is the output that you produce. So generally they are equal to each other. And we also know that the components of aggregate demand include consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which means exports minus imports. So it says that the country's exports have decreased. Therefore, if the exports decrease, then the net exports will also decrease. That means aggregate demand will also decrease. GDP will also decrease because they are equal to each other. So if GDP decreases, GNI will also decrease. Then it decreases here and decreases here too. However, that doesn't explicitly, again, talk about why NNI and GNI specifically, why NNI is explicitly less than GNI. Now let's just check the last one and cross this one off. So the last one says there has been a net depreciation in the value of the country's fixed capital assets. We know what depreciation or net depreciation is, and the country's fixed capital assets are essentially, since it says fixed assets, right? So those are long-term assets, or assets meaning an item or thing that will be here for a long time. For example, land, buildings, whatnot. So obviously, these goods or these assets will of course depreciate. That's what it's saying. It's saying that there has been a depreciation in these assets. And that is the reason, it's saying that this is the reason why NNI is less than GNI. And well, that is true, because NNI will always be less than GNI because depreciation is deducted from NNI because it's not, doesn't have gross in its name. So we do not count depreciation in its calculation. So D makes the most sense. So D is our option, and that's correct. Now we're going to number 17. So erasing this part, number 17 says that Asha is currently unemployed. She has been offered a job but has decided to decline the offer in search for a better job, right? Decided to decline the offer and search for a better job. What type of unemployment is this? Unemployment is a condition or a situation where an individual does not have a paid job, although they are actively searching for it and they are willing to do work. So we are given 4 types of unemployment here. So let's just go through each of the meanings of each unemployment and then see which one fits best for has been offered a job but has decided to decline the offer and search for a better job. So the first one is cyclical unemployment, and cyclical unemployment mainly happens due to lack of aggregate demand, or AD. So this occurs when there is an economic decline or there is a recession. So cyclical unemployment mainly because of lack of aggregate demand, so lacking aggregate demand. The next one is frictional unemployment, which means that this is unemployment where you are between jobs. So, of course, not everyone's going to be employed in the same place all their lives. They're going to switch around jobs and do that. But of course, you are not going to be able to immediately get employed after you quit or leave a job. So the time in between that, where you are between jobs, that is called frictional unemployment. While after you have quit a job and you are looking for a new one, well, of course, you're not going to immediately get a new one. The time in between, the gap in between, that is frictional unemployment in a sense. Seasonal unemployment is when you are seasonally employed, or you're only employed for a certain period of time because that service or good is only offered during that period of time. For example, let's say there is an amusement park that only shows up in a specific place once a year for a month. So that will be seasonal unemployment, because if you worked at that amusement park, that would only be present for 1 month. So after that 1 month, your job is gone, and that will be seasonal unemployment because you are only employed seasonally, or when that service or good is offered, that time period. The last one says structural unemployment. And as the name itself suggests, it's when the structure of the economy changes, so you become unemployed because your skill set doesn't match what the economy needs anymore. For example, technology has been improving a lot these days. So let's say on certain farms, you would usually have manual labor plucking or planting crops. However, now we have tractors and machineries to do that for us. So those who used to be employed to manually do that work are now replaced with tractors. most of them at least. So that is because the structure of the economy has changed. It is now relying on capital or technology. So you become unemployed because of that, because your skill, what you can do, it has been replaced by a machine. So those are the 4 types. And now which type of unemployment is her unemployment? It's because she has been offered a job but has decided to decline the offer and search for a better paid job. Is this cyclical unemployment? It doesn't talk about aggregate demand, doesn't talk about recession or falling GDP, so cannot be the first one. The next one, frictional unemployment, when you have the gap between jobs. So it says that she has been offered a job, but she declined it to search for a better one. So frictional unemployment can also apply to the time between when you are searching for a job. So it could be frictional, so we'll keep that in mind. Seasonal unemployment. It doesn't talk about how her original or previous job was only for a certain period of time. It doesn't really mention anything about seasonal jobs or temporary jobs for during a specific time period, so it can't be seasonal. Last one, structural. It doesn't talk about Asha being replaced by anything or the economy or the market structure changing at all, so it can't be this one. So the option that makes the most sense is frictional unemployment. So that will be our option, and that is correct. Moving on to number 18. It says that a major trading nation, country X, is in equilibrium at full employment level of real output. Then there is a recession in its main international markets. What are the most likely consequences of this change for country X? And then in our options below, we're given rate of inflation and unemployment. And since this question is talking about equilibrium and international markets and a recession, we know that we can show this on an aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So what I'll do first is just draw that first. And then we have our aggregate demand curve. And since it's talking about full employment level, right, we can show that on a long run aggregate supply curve, and the vertical line is where you will be at full employment because you cannot increase your aggregate supply beyond that. So of course you're using all of your resources or employing all of them to its fullest around if you are at a point, if your equilibrium point is anywhere on this vertical line. Right, so we have our price level here, and this is our RGDP or output. And then this is our aggregate demand curve and our long run aggregate supply curve. So what does the question say again? It says that the country X is in equilibrium at full employment level. So it will, here's our equilibrium. And if it is at the full employment level, that means that our demand curve, aggregate demand curve, will intersect the long run aggregate supply where it is vertical, because at that point you can't increase in your aggregate supply anymore. So that means that you have employed it to its fullest, right? So our equilibrium point will be there. And so this is where original price level is and original RGDP is. And now what happens is that there is a recession in the main international markets. If there is a recession, that means that the economy is in a decline. And that means that aggregate demand will decrease because of falling GDP, as a recession means that your aggregate demand is falling. If your aggregate demand falls, that means your aggregate demand curve will shift to the left because it decreases, right? So this is your new curve right here. And this is your new equilibrium point then. So our new equilibrium point now correlates to this. So we know, let's just label our original equilibrium, and this is the new one. So this is our original price level, and this is the original output level. I'll just use Q. And this is our new price level and new output level. So we know that our price level has decreased and our quantity, our GDP or output has also decreased. So what are the consequences for this change in country X? For the rate of inflation ties to the price level, because what is inflation? Inflation is the gradual increase in the general price level over a period of time. And as for unemployment, what unemployment essentially means is that people are not being employed, and people meaning labor, the factor of production labor, which is a part of the aggregate supply because it is a resource, right? As you can see, for example, with these little segments along the long run aggregate supply curve, this is where you have the most aggregate supply or the most labor in a sense. And this is where you have the least aggregate supply or labor. So if our point has moved from this point to here, that means that our labor or aggregate supply has decreased. So if the amount of labor being employed has decreased, that just basically means that unemployment has increased. So what we're looking for is that since the price level falls, that means that the inflation is falling. So the rate of inflation will fall. And since the level of labor being employed is also falling, we are looking for an increase in unemployment, because decreasing employment means increasing unemployment. So let's just look at the table and see which one correlates with our two verdicts, and that will be our option. So the rate of inflation needs to decrease, and the rate of unemployment needs to increase. So B makes sense. So B will be our option, and that is correct. Now moving on to question number 19, erasing this thing. It says, why would a fall in a country's average price level cause its aggregate demand curve to slope downwards? So since we are talking about the aggregate demand curve, let's just draw the curve for better visualization. So we're just only going to draw the aggregate demand curve. So this is our aggregate demand curve, and we know that this is price level, and the x-axis is our GDP or output. So it says that if there is a fall in a country's average price level, the aggregate demand curve tends to slope downwards. Meaning if we have a price level or average price level at this point, and this is our aggregate demand, if it falls, then aggregate demand also falls and slopes downwards. The gradient is negative and it's going downwards. So why is that? Essentially, you need to know the reasons behind why this curve slopes downwards. And there are actually 3 reasons for why that can be. The first one being the wealth effect. Now, what this means is that, for example, if the price level falls, then that means that the prices have fallen. The price of goods have fallen. So if the price of goods fall, that means your purchasing power increases. Now, what does that mean? Well, for example, if you have an income of $100, doesn't look like 100, but okay, you have an income of $100, and let's say that a piece of chocolate is sold for $10. And you are a person who really likes chocolates, so you spend all your income on chocolates all the time. So that means that if one bar of chocolate or 1 unit of chocolate costs $10 and you have $100, then that means you can buy 10 chocolate bars. But, okay, we have the same amount of income, but now price level has fallen, or the prices have fallen. So let's say that the price of chocolate has fallen from $10 to $5. So it's cheaper now. So for your same income, how many bars of chocolate or units of chocolate can you buy? 100 divided by 5 is 20 units of chocolate. So that is increased purchasing power, meaning you can buy more goods for the same income. Your purchasing power can increase if your income increases or if the price of the goods decreases, which basically means that you can buy more goods for the same value of money. Right, so if this happens, we also know that the components of aggregate demand include consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, which is exports minus imports. If the price level falls and if we have increased purchasing power, that means that we can buy more stuff. So of course, consumption will be stimulated, consumption will increase. Because of course we're going to buy more stuff and spend on more stuff. So if the value or the component of consumption increases, that means aggregate demand will increase as well. So if aggregate demand also increases, since aggregate demand is also equal to GDP, because what you demand is what you produce, is the value that you produce, your output, that means that fall of a price level, purchasing power increases, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases, and GDP will increase. But you might argue, wait, no, because aggregate demand increases. That means that an increase in aggregate demand means that the curve will shift to the right. So it should be like this. Yeah, and that's true. But that is only if the increase in aggregate demand is caused by an increase in its components. But the increase in the components should not be because of a change in price level. So if it is due to a change in price level and the component increases and aggregate demand increases, it only has an extension or contraction, which means that the point only moves along the curve. There is no increase or shift in the curve. So this is not to be confused by a government policy such as fiscal policy or monetary policy being used to affect one of these components to increase aggregate demand and causing a shift in the aggregate demand. Yes, that's correct. However, because this shift or this change, not shift, this change is caused by a change in the price level, so there will be a contraction or extension along the curve instead. So this is the wealth effect because of a decrease in price level and increased purchasing power, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases, so therefore GDP increases. And because this is due to a change in the price level, it moves along the curve and it has an extension, and that means it increases in our GDP. So that explains its gradient or its relationship between price level and GDP. So that is the first reason. The second reason is the interest rate effect. And how this works is, as the name suggests, we do involve interest rates. So let me just erase these parts first for a clearer. Right, so we know that the interest rate refers to the cost of borrowing and the reward for saving. So let's say, for example, that the price level has decreased once again. So if the price level decreases, the price level also can indicate the level of inflation in the economy, because as the definition of inflation states, it is the gradual increase in the general price level over a period of time. Therefore, if the price level falls, that means that inflation is falling. So if inflation is falling, that must be a good thing, right? But governments seek price stability, meaning they do not want the price level or inflation to fluctuate a lot. They don't want it to increase by a large amount or to decrease by a large amount either. So whenever it increases, they will try to make it decrease so that it can meet at a middle point, and so it will look like it's stable, that it never moved at all. So since the price level has decreased and inflation has decreased, the government's going to be like, no, we want it to be stable, so we're going to increase it a little bit again. So how are we going to do that? We're, of course, going to use the interest rate, which is a type of monetary policy that is also known as a demand-side policy because it influences the aggregate demand curve, and that's how we try to manipulate the price level or inflation. So as we said, interest rates are the cost of borrowing and the price and the reward for saving. So if there is lower inflation and we want to increase the inflation and stimulate it, then that means that we will decrease interest rates, because now the cost of borrowing will fall and the reward for saving will also fall. So since it looks more attractive to borrow because it's less expensive to borrow, more people will borrow more disposable income, so more consumption because you can spend more, and more purchasing power, of course. So same case, consumption increases due to a change in price level, therefore aggregate demand increases, and of course, because what you demand is what you produce, GDP increases, and same case, price level falls, a lot of this stuff in between, and the RGDP increases. And that, my friends, is the interest rate effect. Now, the final effect is called the trade effect, also known as the exchange rate effect. And what this refers to is, of course, international change, your exports and imports. So, same case, same example again. If the price level falls, then, of course, the price of your goods fall. So if the price of your goods fall, that also means that the price of your exports fall, because your exports are the same domestic goods that you produce in your own economy. Those are the same ones that you're exporting outside. So the price of those are the same as the price of your exports. So if the price of exports fall, then they become more internationally competitive. So what that means is that if you compare the price of your exports with the price of other foreign exports, yours seem more cheaper, so they're more attractive because people like cheap things. Therefore, you become more internationally competitive. So if you are more competitive, then people are likely to demand for your exports more. So you might be able to sell more exports. So in your aggregate demand, you may have an increase in your export sales. So therefore, your net exports will increase. If your net exports increase, aggregate demand increases. So as aggregate demand, what you demand is the same as what you produce. GDP increases. So because this is caused by a change in the price level, if your price level falls, then your GDP increases because of the entire process I just mentioned just now. So there you have it, the three main reasons you need to know to explain the downward sloping curve or the relationship, the downward sloping curve of the aggregate demand or the relationship between price level and our GDP that explains the aggregate demand. Now that we know our reasons, our options should relate to one of these reasons. So let's check each one and see which one is the most related. The first one says it leads to an increase in interest rates. If there is a fall in the price level, right, then your inflation, so this must be the interest rate effect because of course it says interest rates, explicitly says that. So if, right, there's a fall in the country's price level, then as we want price stability, we want to try to increase that price level to counter the change in inflation. So therefore, we're going to decrease interest rates so that the cost of borrowing will decrease and people will be more attracted to borrowing more and buying more. So it says that there will be an increase in interest rates if there is a fall in price level. Now that's not true because we want to stimulate the inflation again. So interest rates must fall for consumption to increase. So if this had said that it will lead to a decrease in interest rates, this would make more sense. However, since it says increase, it's the opposite of what we're looking for. So this can't be it. So we're going to cross it off and check the next one. The next one says, it reduces the real value of money balances. What do we mean by real value of money balances? Well, this basically refers to purchasing power because the purchasing power can also be known as the real value of your money because that's how much it determines your ability to buy stuff depending on the level of your income or the prices of the goods, right? So real value of money balances is also equal to purchasing power in a sense. So let's just read it as that. So it says that if we have a fall in the price level, it will reduce our real value of money. But that's not true because if the price level falls, because stuff is cheaper as the prices decrease, you can buy more stuff. The value of your money or your income has increased. It will not be reduced. So this should be increased, not reduced. So this one's not it because it's the opposite. Let's look at the next one. The next one says that it makes the country's goods cheaper relative to foreign goods. Now this must be relating to the trade effect because the country's goods are also equivalent to the exports because the country's goods are what you export. They are not two separate things. So the country's goods are also known as the exports, so let's just read it like that. It makes the exports cheaper relative to foreign goods. So if the price level decreases, the price of your exports decreases, which makes them more internationally competitive. So yes, it becomes cheaper relative to, in comparison to other foreign goods that are being exported in the market because the price of your exports or your country's goods have become cheaper. So this makes sense, yeah. So let's just keep that in mind and look at the last one. The last one says it leads to the expectation of future price falls. Now, when it says future price falls, it reminds me of consumer confidence or how consumers generally feel about the outlook of the economy. However, this doesn't explicitly tie to any of these reasons. So it's unrelated, so we're just going to cross that off, and our final option left is C, and that is correct. I'm going to erase this part to make room for the last one. So now we have number 20. Number 20, to counter deflation, a central bank uses an expansionary monetary policy. What is likely to result? Okay, so what is deflation first? Well, you might think, well, deflation sounds like inflation, and since inflation means rising prices, deflation will probably mean decreasing prices, right? Well, that's not exactly how it works. Well, you see, inflation as a full definition means that it's a gradual increase in the general price level over a period of time. And what this means that the prices will probably be changing at a percentage that is above 0%. So maybe 1% every year. Oh yeah, the percent is not there then. But yeah, maybe 1% every year or 2% every year. And let's say, for example, it is right now 2026. Let's say the rate of inflation, this is just an example, this is not realistic, but let's say the rate of inflation is 2%, meaning that the prices have risen by 2% in comparison to last year. And let's say next year, 2027, the inflation decreases, meaning the rate of which the price increases has now decreased down to 1%. So if that increases, that means that it's actually disinflation because the rate of which the prices increase has decreased. That is what you would call decreasing inflation if you like. However, deflation, on the other hand, means that prices are literally falling. If there is disinflation, the prices are still rising. It's just rising at a slower rate because it's rising at 1%, not at 2%. But if we have deflation, that means that prices are falling, meaning the percentage at which the prices are rising will be below 0%. So it will be in the minus zone, meaning it will decrease essentially. So deflation is where prices are falling, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's decreasing inflation. Anyway, now that we have that down, what is an expansionary monetary policy? Well, first of all, the monetary policy is a demand-side policy that is usually executed is a rough word, but it's usually controlled by the central bank, meaning it's a set of policies that manipulate or influence aggregate demand to increase or decrease to influence the rate of inflation. So very quickly, if we draw an aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, so we have our price level, I'll just do price level, and this will be output or real GDP. And then our downward sloping curve is our aggregate demand curve, and our upward sloping curve is our short run aggregate supply curve. And of course, we have the equilibrium point right here. So this is our current price level, this is our current output. So what I mean when I say that the monetary policy influences aggregate demand is that, well, its policies can increase or decrease aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand increases, then the curve of the aggregate demand will shift to the right. Let's go with red actually. It will shift to the right. So this is the new curve, and this will be the new equilibrium point. And you will see that the price level increases. If the price level increases, that also means that inflation has increased. So monetary policy can influence the price level or the inflation by increasing or decreasing aggregate demand. But in this case, since the central bank uses an expansionary monetary policy, we're trying to increase aggregate demand so that inflation or the general price level will rise. If this had said contractionary monetary policy, that means that we are trying to decrease both values. Now, the question says that to counter deflation, the central bank uses an expansionary monetary policy. So that means to counter deflation, meaning we have falling prices. But of course, one of the government objectives, this is 0%, one of the government objectives is to have stable inflation or stable price levels. Although prices are falling, well, you might think, oh, prices are falling, so that's good. No, because everything's cheaper now. But that's not the case, because if prices fall, then our GDP or output will also fall. And if your output falls, your economic growth falls. So that's not very ideal. Therefore, we want to counter that. So we want to make sure that the prices are stable. So if your prices are falling, how are you going to stabilize it? You're going to make them increase or rise again to hopefully get to the 0% point, but that's not going to happen. But at least we don't want it to fluctuate as much. So to counter deflation, we're going to try to increase inflation or increase the price level. That is the aim. And of course, we are going to use our monetary policy to do that, and there are different types of monetary policy. But if you continue reading the question, it asks, what is likely to result? It hasn't asked us what the policies are or what specific ones we are supposed to use. It has just asked us if we did use this expansionary monetary policy, what's going to happen, what's going to result. So clearly, like I said earlier, if we use an expansionary monetary policy, that means that we want aggregate demand to increase so that the price level will increase. And that's exactly what we want, because since there is deflation, we want to counter it with inflation. So the result of whatever policy we use will be to increase aggregate demand, to increase the price level. So that's the result, these two things, aggregate demand increasing and the price level increasing. So we can just look for that in our options. So let's go through each one. To answer this question, we don't really need to know the specific monetary policies that we need to use. But still, let's look at the options. The first one says a higher cost of borrowing. Now, this seems to be related to interest rates, which is related to one of the monetary policies. But is that a result? Because we use the monetary policy, does the cost of borrowing increase? No. We are probably going to use the cost of borrowing or the interest rates for the result to happen, which is to increase aggregate demand. So that's not it. Let's cross it off. The second one says an increase in aggregate demand. Oh, that just matches up perfectly. But let's keep this in mind and check the other options. The third one says an appreciation of the exchange rate. Now this can also relate to a monetary policy, which could be related to its foreign exchange reserves. However, is that a result of using the policy? No, that seems to be referring to the policy itself. So that's not what the question is asking us for, so we're going to cross that off. The next one says an increase in government debt. Now this seems to be about government spending. So since government spending is done, of course, by the government, that will be related to a fiscal policy, not a monetary policy, because monetary policies are, of course, related to the central bank. And the central bank does not control the government budget or its debt. The government itself does. So this isn't even a monetary policy, and this doesn't even talk about a result. So that can't be it either. So we're going to cross that off. And of course, since B is our only option left, we're going to take that one, and that is correct.